Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Chemistry on the Fly with Mr. F. Today we're going to talk about 7.10 chemistry of our bodies. So, what are we made of? Well, it turns out that we're made out of 6 elements, mostly made out of 6 elements. And they are carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Now, these are not in any particular order other than the fact that they make a really pretty cool acrostic, and it's called CHNOPS. CHNOPS. So, let's look at how our body's made of in percentages. So, if we take a typical human body, we are actually 65% made out of oxygen. We're made out of 18.5% of carbon. We're made out of hydrogen 9.5%. Then we go to nitrogen at 3.2%. Then we've got a little slice of phosphorus at 1%, and then even a littler slice of sulfur at 0.3%. Now, to top us off, we've got some things called trace elements, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Now, I want you to notice that each of these have an asterisk on them. Now, these are percentages by mass. So I'm going to put a little percentage by mass on the bottom here. Now, what this means is that oxygen has, by 65% of our body is made out of oxygen by mass. Now, if I were to look at our body from a different perspective, if I were to look at it by the number of atoms, it turns out, and I didn't show the graphic here, but hydrogen is by far the most atoms in our bodies. But it turns out that a hydrogen is so much less massive than oxygen that it takes up only about 10% or 9.5% of our body by mass. Now remember, a hydrogen is only going to be 1 proton, so it's going to have a mass of 1, where oxygen is going to have 8 protons and 8 neutrons in its nucleus, and that means it's going to have a mass of 16. So oxygen is 16 times more massive than hydrogen is. But if we look at by mass, it was still 62% of our body by atoms, would be hydrogen, would be 62% of our bodies. So most of our body is actually made out of hydrogen atoms, but by mass, it's oxygen. All right, so let's look at each of our CHNOPS. So our first element on our CHNOPS list is going to be carbon, and that's 18.5%. Now I'm going to be showing the number of valence electrons for each of our elements because this is really important in how things bond to each other. Now carbon is very important because it has 4 bonding spots, and that makes it really helpful for creating life or sustaining life, and we'll see that in a second. Now, we're going to pick up another term here. It's called organic. Now, this is kind of a weird term lately because organic in the grocery store could mean anything from, it could mean that there's no herbicides. It could be there's no pesticides used. It could be that there's no hormones being used or antibiotics being used. But organic in chemistry actually has a completely different meaning. And all organic means in chemistry is that there's carbon in the molecule. So it means it's carbon based. So we talk about something in chemistry that's organic, it just means that it has carbon in it. And if it doesn't have carbon in it, then it's not organic. Now, we call carbon the building block of life. And it really stems from having those 4 valence electrons. We can make really, really complex things when we have 4 things to connect to. So if we look at, this happens to be a glucose molecule, and you can see how complex it is. It's got a bunch of hydrogens and carbons, and we've mentioned glucose before. It's C6H12O6. And this is just a very complex molecule, but it's all based on the fact that carbon can have 4 bonding spots. And if you look at any of the carbons in this molecule, they're the darker blackish ones. You can see that they all have four connections to them. Now, other elements like nitrogen or oxygen can't have four connections. In fact, oxygen can only have two connections. Nitrogen can have three, and we don't even see nitrogen in here. That's a carbohydrate. Now, fats, these are long chains of carbons and hydrogens. This is actually called a saturated fat, and we'll learn about that in a little bit. Okay, and then our last one is proteins. Now, this I'm showing here is just a small part of a protein. This is an amino acid, and you can see I have some carbons in here as well. So these are all parts of what carbon is basically in everything that we have, that we need: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Let's look at our next one in our shops list. We have hydrogen. This is at almost 10%, 9.5%. And we have one valence electron, and I'm showing it as both the Lewis dot diagram and the Bohr model here. You'll see why in a second. And of course, we know that hydrogen is in water. There's two hydrogens in each water. Now, we're going to talk about water separately at the end of this presentation, but right now we know that it is in water. And I'm showing also a different type of molecule representation. This is called a ball and stick model, where I have the atoms are shown as balls, and then the sticks are actually shown as the bonds between those. It's a little bit different, and it's actually a little bit easier to see molecules when they're in this format versus the sphere models that we've been using in the past. So, as a cation, now let's talk about a cation first. So what does that mean? A cation means that it is going to have a positive charge. Well, how does that have a positive charge? It has more protons than electrons. So in a cation, it's actually going to lose an electron. So we took our electron off of our Lewis dot diagram. Then we'll remember we have to put the brackets around it and a +1. Now, when we look at the Lewis dot or the Bohr model, we'll see that if I take the electron away, I take the electron cloud away as well, which leaves me just with a lone proton sitting there all by itself. So I'm not even sure this is legal, but I'm going to put a bracket, a +1 around that sole proton as well, just to show that this is what it's looking like. And it is a cation. Okay, now as a cation, it's created or used in many body systems, including respiration, which is breathing, metabolism, which is going to be the processing of food into energy, and homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is kind of a new word for us. This is kind of a word that I like to think of as if we were thinking back at our electrons and they're being in an excited state or a ground state. This is like an electron being in its ground state, in its happy at home state. And this is really just like the idea of well-being. So when you say a system is in homeostasis, it means it's in a stable state and very, very likes to be here. So all those things are important with hydrogen. All right, let's look at the next one on our Schnapps list, and this is going to be nitrogen at 3.2%. Again, nitrogen is going to have 5 valence electrons. It happens to be in group 5A. And this is going to be the base in our amino acids. And we'll talk about amino acids a lot when we talk about proteins. So this happens to be another amino acid. And here is our nitrogen. This actually is called, in the circle there, it's called actually an amino group. And that's very important in our amino acids because these amino acids bond together. The amino group bonds with the group on the other side to make long, long chains of amino acids to make proteins. Okay, and then proteins are really interesting because they make up just about everything in our body. They make up muscles and skin and blood and hair and nail, enzymes, hormones, and DNA. This is a representation of a hormone. It's called HGH. It's human growth hormone. And you can see that this is a very, very, very complex molecule. There's probably 120 amino acids in this molecule, all in different shapes and all in different orientations just to get this shape, this particular shape. And proteins are very complex molecules, and they're built up with the basics of amino acids, but nitrogen's right in the middle of those amino acids, being that it's in the amino group there. All right, so let's move on to the big daddy here. This is going to be oxygen at 65%. Okay, it's going to have 6 valence electrons. There's our Lewis dot diagram. And as we know, oxygen is very prevalent in water. There's 1 oxygen in each water molecule, and it's needed to burn fuel in our bodies. That's why we breathe in oxygen. Now, if you recall our combustion reactions, we had fuel plus oxygen is going to yield carbon dioxide and water. Now, from the big picture, this is in life. If we took propane and put it onto our grill, the propane would be our fuel. We'd have oxygen from the air. We would create carbon dioxide and water. And if we're any good, we would create some really good, juicy hamburgers. But in our bodies, we actually don't use propane as a fuel. We actually use a sugar. In this case, we would use glucose. This is the C6H12O6 molecule we saw a little bit earlier, plus 6 oxygens, and we would yield 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters. Now you're thinking, well, wait a minute, we have all of these little combustion reactions going on in our body? Not necessarily, but this is the big picture of what happens. We have sugar coming in, we add oxygen to it, and we'll learn a lot about this next year in biology, but this is a process that takes a whole bunch of steps, but this is the beginning of the product, or the beginning of the reactants and the products that we would see. So this is going to be a very important reaction, and oxygen is right in the middle of it. The next one is a little guy. It's only 1%. This is phosphorus. And just like before, we're showing that it has 5 valence electrons. It helps in repairing tissues and cells, filtering waste, and the one for me is going to be energy transfer and storage. Now, this is a really complex molecule, and it's called adenosine triphosphate, and most people just call it ATP for short, which makes a lot of sense. But this is where energy is stored within our body. We want, as we go through the metabolism process, we want to change our sugars into creating energy to be stored, and also so that this energy can be stored and then used later. And ATP is the big thing that happens here. And we'll see why. Now, the phosphorus comes in because the T, again, it stands for adenosine triphosphate. So the triphosphate is right here. So there's 1 phosphate, there's 2 phosphates, there's my 3rd phosphate. And what happens is the energy between these phosphates is stored in the bonds. So this bond right here is what is storing the energy. So when I take that phosphate off and I break that bond, I actually release a huge amount of energy that the system around it can use. So that is super, super important in our energy storage and usage in our bodies. So phosphorus, even though it's only 1%, is a huge player in our bodies. The last one that we're going to talk about in our schnapps list is sulfur. Now, sulfur is only 0.3%. So the last one we're going to talk about is sulfur. Sulfur, and notice, is only 0.3%, so it's not a whole lot of sulfur in our bodies. But it does have some really critical, important things to do. So the first thing, there's our valence electrons. It's very similar to oxygen. It has 6 valence electrons. And it is in amino acids. And these are really critical amino acids for our bodies. The first one is cysteine, that's the one on the right. And the second one is methionine, and that is the one more in the center. And you'll notice that the yellow dots in these have the sulfur in it. And these are really critical to the synthesis of a whole bunch of different proteins. Okay, the first one of the important ones is collagen, and collagen is used in our skin, and it's used in our bones and in our structures that hold us all together. And then the last one, or the second one, is insulin. Now, insulin is very critical in the metabolism of how we take our sugars and we break them down into um, the various energy, and eventually we want to get to ATP, which we just mentioned in the last one. Okay, so the last thing we've got is their trace elements. Now these are 3.5% of the total, but none of them have any large amounts. They're all going to be less than 0.3%. Now, I'm going to give you a list of some of them. Now, this list is only part of it. There's a whole bunch of trace elements that we have in our body that do various things, but we're going to go through some of the ones that we've heard of. The first one I'm sure we've heard of is iron. We know iron is in our hemoglobin in our blood, and that's why our blood's red. And it transports oxygen from the lungs and takes it to the bodies, the cells and the tissues in our bodies so that we can actually function. Okay, the next one is calcium, and we know that calcium is important in bone structure and strength. Zinc improves immune function, and it helps in blood clot, or helps our blood to clot. The next one is chromium. It helps insulin function. The next one is going to be magnesium, and this is going to help in the metabolism. And then the next three are called antioxidants. This is copper, selenium, and manganese. These selenium and manganese you may not have heard of. And copper, I wouldn't necessarily suggest you go eat a penny, but in copper in small amounts is called an antioxidant, and these help prevent cell damage. So that's all of to fill up our whole body. So we talked about oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, phosphorus, nitrogen, and then the trace elements. And I think I missed one in there. I think I missed hydrogen. Oh well. But that's all the things that make up our body. Now we're going to take another look at our body from a slightly different perspective. And we've talked an awful lot about water this year. And we know water is H2O. And if we look at our body, 60% of our body is actually water. And then the other 40% is going to be the rest of the SNOPS elements, including the trace elements. So nearly all of the major systems in our body depend on water. It's vital in carrying minerals and oxygen to our cells through our blood and other transport mechanisms. Okay, it protects our organs and our tissues. It regulates our body temperature. It aids the body in removing waste. It lubricates our joints. And that's only a few of the things that water is important in. Now, before we go, I do want to introduce Mr. Ben Sherwood. And he wrote a book, and it has some kind of interesting things to say. So, survival rule of 3. This is all according to Ben Sherwood. You can survive 3 seconds without spirit or hope, 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 hours without shelter in extreme conditions, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, and 3 months without companionship or love. That's all according to Ben Sherwood. Thanks, Ben. So, stay safe and strong, Hampton. That's all we've got today for Chemistry on the Fly with Mr. F. And as always, have a great day.